Hello everyone, this is Direwolf20 and welcome to part 3 of my Steve's Factory Manager mod spotlight. So last two episodes we've covered a lot of crazy stuff that you can do with Steve's Factory Manager. Everything from manipulating inventories to emitting redstone signals to moving liquids around, moving items around, controlling how many items go into spots. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Today's episode is pretty much going to be focused around some of the really advanced features in Steve's Factory Manager. There'll be some basic stuff too, so those of you who are a little bit afraid, don't fear, you can definitely still stay and watch. But we will also be covering some of the advanced stuff too. So we're going to get into, let's see, we should cover variables and the for loop. We'll probably also want to configure command groups and nodes. And then we'll also look at camouflages and signs. And then we'll finally probably wrap up taking a look at cable clusters and some of that cool stuff that's available. So let's get started on part 3. Alright guys, let's first talk about variables. So variables are a way to dynamically decide which inventory to interact with based on certain conditionals. So it's a cool way to figure out, what to do with things based on other things, if you want to think about it in as basic a term as possible. So the first thing you want to do is define a variable, and we'll get into the difference between global and local variables in just a minute. But the variable can basically be a color. So you've got, the 16 Minecraft colors here. So we'll just stick with white for the basic one first. The next thing you want to define for this variable is the different types of containers that can be stored in this variable. By default, it's everything, but maybe you only want to look at inventories so you can disable everything else. We'll do that for now just because. Finally, we can take a look at all the containers that are on the network. Notice that it's only showing you inventory containers. If we had included tanks in this list, tanks would also be listed as a possible container type. This is important for more advanced stuff later on, but for now we'll specify that we're going to define this variable as just being the type to be able to store in inventory. So for now, I'll go ahead and use the chest. Okay, and then finally the connections, declaration versus standard. We'll get into that in a minute too, but for now I'm going to declare it. So basically, we're creating a variable, which by the way doesn't have any input or outputs because this just sits here and does its thing. So basically, we just set up that the white variable equals the chest, the wooden one. Okay, so now what we can do is create our standard trigger condition with an input. And the input, instead of saying that it's going to be a specific inventory, I'm going to go down here and say show variables. And we're going to say the white variable is the inventory that we want to treat as our input. Okay, we're going to access it from the north face, and we'll have an empty black list, meaning that any item is going to be allowed to be manipulated from it. Finally, this inventory can be the gold chest, and we'll target the north face and an empty black list once again. So let's make sure that we have some items in here, and we'll activate our trigger. And what should happen is the item should get pulled out of the chest and placed in the gold chest because we created a variable and told it the input is not one of these items, but it's actually the white variable. And you can see that's selected right there, and the white variable maps to this chest. Makes sense? Pretty cool, right? Now, if we mapped this thing to the iron chest instead, you'll notice that we'll quickly fill up this gold chest with the copper, or the iron, the gold, and a crafting table that used to live in this iron chest. So we didn't have to manipulate anything over here. We just changed the variable, and it changed what the input chest was. Now, where this could get really cool is, let's go ahead and just change something real quick. I'm going to move these guys out of the way, and I'm going to throw another variable conditional in here. So let's go ahead and grab another variable. And we're going to, instead of using this as a declaration, we're going to create a standard variable type. And you'll notice that this has an input and an output. Now, what we can do here is go ahead and specify whether or not we want to add, remove, or set a variable on the input connection, okay? And we're going to go ahead and, stick with the white variable. And over here, I'm actually going to come over and, you know what? Let's leave things as they are. I'm going to make it so that the iron chest is the input, okay? Let's do this. I'm going to make it add the wooden chest when this thing is actually run. So the white variable, we're going to add the wooden chest, and value order we'll get to in just a minute. And connections we already saw. So when this thing is activated, we're going to go ahead and add the wooden chest to the white variable. And remember, the input target is actually the white variable here. Okay, so let's see what happens when we go ahead and have this run. The way I'm going to do that is we're going to do a conditional. So let me create a conditional trigger, and we'll say that in the event that the gold chest, and we'll target any side, has cobblestone in it, any amount. So right now there's no cobblestone. Whenever that's true, we're going to go ahead and activate this variable input. And we could have something follow after it if we wanted to, but we don't need to at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and create a trigger for that as well. So basically what we're saying is that I'm going to place some items in here, and it doesn't matter what items go in there. When this trigger condition occurs and it checks if the golden chest has cobblestone in it, it's going to go ahead and add the wooden chest to the white variable. And the white variable is the one that is the inventory input for the output to the gold chest. So notice that right now nothing's moved in here. But as soon as we add cobblestone to this gold chest, it should go ahead and add that variable conditional setup. Now, with the current setup that we have, it's not running. And the reason for that is what I told you we'd get to in a minute, which is the global versus local variable set. In a local variable, when you're in a conditional chain like we have here, your connections will, and your variable changes will stay within this change. So we went ahead within this line and changed the variable to add the wooden chest. But because we have nothing after that line, it's going ahead and resetting it back to its original value because it's local. Okay, so now it's continuing to be just the iron chest as the input for now. That's why nothing is moving right now. And if we go ahead and throw cobble in here, we'll see it's still not moving items around. However, that's only because it's a local variable. Now, if we want this to work and keep it a local variable, we can simply add this change after here. So all we have to do is, let's take the cobble out of this for now, just to prove this. We'll connect our variable output to the input line here. And we'll note that the items still aren't being moved out of the wooden chest into the gold one. But as soon as I put cobblestone in there, they will all get moved over. That's because this is a local variable and it stays within this connection line. Okay. Now, if we didn't want it to stay within the connection line, so let's reverse everything. I'm going to go ahead and put these items back in here. All we have to do is make this a global variable. And now this variable will be changed globally across the whole command structure, regardless of which conditional line it's within or which workflow it's in. So let's go ahead and change this variable type to global to make sure there's no cobble in here. Switch it to global and throw cobble in, and everything should show up. There it is. So as you can see, variables could be pretty useful. You could check for the condition of items in your network here, or you could check for redstone conditions, and then go ahead and add or remove chests from the input or output section using variables. And of course, variables can also contain multiple inventories. So if you wanted your variable set to contain iron, gold, and wooden chests as all your variables, you could input from all three of those chests all together if you wanted to. You don't have to. You can, of course, change your variables with conditional workflows. All kinds of cool stuff you can do. Now, the other thing you can work with on variables is the for each loop. So it's important for you to understand variables before we get into the for each loop. So we're going to check that out now. The for loop is pretty nifty. So the for each loop can go through every inventory in a variable and do the same set of instructions for each of them. So let's go ahead and set up multiple wooden chests here. So let's go ahead and grab a couple more wooden chests, and I'll put them on either side of this thing just to make it easy. Okay. Our variable we're going to go ahead and define as a local variable, and its container types will be inventories, and we're going to go ahead and deselect everything and make sure that we're selecting all three chests as containers inside this variable. Okay, and we're declaring it. Now our trigger will connect to the for each loop, and we're basically going to choose our list variable, and that's going to be a white variable, and then we have an element, which we'll get to in a minute. Okay, so we're going to go through each of the inventories in the white variable, which in this case will be the three different chests, and we're going to do something to them. Okay, so let's go ahead and control that. And what that's going to do is we're going to run this line from here to go to what we're going to actually do to it. So let's say that we're going to create an input and an output. Now for the inventory's input, we want to use a variable. So first I'm going to go ahead and define one. It's going to be a local variable and it's going to be orange. I'm going to let it be any container type and I'm not going to specify what it is just yet. Okay? I'm just going to declare that orange variable as being available to be used, and that's important because your variables in your for each loop, both of them need to be declared before you can actually use them. Okay? I'm going to have my input be the orange variable, because what's going to happen is when this for each loop goes through, it's going to go through each item in the white variables container, and the element is going to be the orange variable. That's going to be the one it's currently working on. So first it's going to hit this chest and it's going to put this chest in the orange variable. It's going to do whatever I tell it, and then it's going to move on to the next chest, and this will then be the orange variable, and it'll move on to the next one. So we'll let that run. We'll say your input is your orange variable. Your target doesn't matter, we'll just activate there, and items will be an empty blacklist. In fact, you know what? I'm going to make it a cobblestone. Whoops, cobblestone. And we're going to specify 5 of them. Cool. And we're going to connect this for each loop here. And then we're going to connect to the output, which we'll define as the gold chest. Easy enough. Activate, and an empty blacklist. Cool. So gold chest currently empty, and we've got cobblestone in all 3 of these chests. When we activate this trigger, what should happen is it'll go through that each loop, and it'll pull 5 from each chest, one at a time. So you can see it's pulling 5 from each chest, and it's going through each one and pulling them out. Nifty. But of course, remember on your input for your define multi-selection, make sure to have it on run command once per target. And then what we'll do here is just break this trigger for a minute, and this should exactly work the way I anticipated. Let's see, put these guys in here. And if we connect our trigger again, we'll see that each chest is losing 5 cobblestone on each iteration, and we're gaining 5 cobblestone each time, or 15 cobblestone going into the gold chest. So each time the loop goes through, it hits each input in order in that variable list. Pretty nifty. Finally, loop order defines what order it goes through the loop. So standard order, cable order, or randomized. Cable order would go like, how far away it is. It would try and go in sequence, or randomized. It would completely randomize, how it picks which chest to pull from first, basically, in the loop. So guys, that's variables and for loops. You can basically define variables, set up this many inventories as part of this variable, and then do a bunch of stuff with that variable, adding, removing, setting it, and of course, looping through it. Some pretty powerful stuff if you have a use for it. Like I said in the past, right? So Steve's Factory Manager, it's got some very basic functionality. It's got some extremely complex, advanced functionality. You guys may go and never use something like a for loop, but if you're building something really super complicated that really is very specific, you might find a good use for things like variables and for loops. It really depends how complex your build is. So now let's talk about groups. Let's say that you might be this crazy guy who likes to automate all the things, and you want to have this really complex bunch of commands. Well, there's not that much real estate on this screen to have a ton of different stuff. So that's where groups come in. Groups allow you to have like a bunch of different commands all inside one. They're not really functions because they're not reusable, but they're basically a bunch of commands all inside one little module. So let's take a look. We'll note here that you can either drop commands here to put them in the group, or click to open the group. So let's grab something like, an input command, right? All we have to do if we want that to be part of this group is simply drag it on top. Boom. And now it's inside the group. You can see it's just inside that group somewhere. It's like a little container. And if we click in here, we'll be able to see that the group has that input command in it. So let's go ahead and, just create an input command. We'll say, hey, the chest from the north side. You guys should be familiar with this for now, right? Blacklist. And then we'll have a output, which will be the gold chest, north side, and an empty blacklist as well, okay? So that anytime this group is run, it's going to grab everything from the chest and dump it into the gold chest, okay? To get this to run, though, we have to actually interact with it in some way. So for that, we're going to need a node. So let's go inside the group here and drop a node. So the node is kind of the way to get this group to run. You can see you can either set it to an input or an output node, and you can have up to 5 input and output nodes on any group. So I'm just going to run this thing from here to here. And you'll note now that I have a node, when we go back out of the group, we can hit this little back out here to close the group. You'll notice that there's now a node here that connects up. And this node is equivalent, basically, to the name of this thing. So if we went in here and changed it, we'll say incoming or something like that, right? When we go out of the group, you'll see that this thing is now named incoming. Cool. So the node is basically your connection to get this thing to run. Without the node, if we went back in there and we got rid of incoming, for example, you'll note that there is no way to get this thing to run. So you're going to want to get it in there somehow, okay? Or you could have just, a trigger inside the group that would be running at all times. That would work just fine too. So if inside this group you had just a trigger running, right, you could just connect the trigger up here and it would move stuff out of the chest and into the gold chest at all times. So the trigger could be inside the group, or, so you can see here it's really just the group all by itself, nothing going on. Or you could have inside the group, you could get rid of the trigger, and you could have your group node, and then outside of the group, have your trigger. So before we connect it, we'll see that items are not flowing from one chest to the next. Nothing happening. But we connect our trigger to the input, which then that trigger is passed along through this node to the input command and then to the output command, and you'll see that the item moved out of the chest into the gold chest, as you would expect. So if you really want to create complex things, you can have a bunch of different groups out there, right? You can have all kinds of different groups doing all kinds of different things, flowing from one set to the next. So if you really want to get super complicated, that's one way to go about it without having to worry about taking up too much screen space. It's really a pretty neat system if you think about it. And like I said, you can have multiple nodes here. So if you do that, you'll see that you have multiple inputs here and here as well. And of course, you'll probably want to name them so that it's more meaningful, especially so you know how to, connect things up. So then you can have this node go to something else and this node go to something else there. Lots of fun. So the next thing on the list to show you guys is pretty nifty. It relates to signs. You can actually update signs using this system. So I'm going to go ahead and plop down the sign updater here, and I'm going to stick a sign on it. Boom, right there. And I'm not going to write anything. What I can do is cause a sign to get updated with information by using this little gadget here, the sign updater. It's real easy. Just go into your signs list and you'll see that sign updater, which is right over here, ready to be selected. There we go. And of course you could do this with variables, and you can do all kinds of other cool stuff if you wanted to. And then your text could be hello, cool, nice. And you can see that it's currently set to update or not. So let's go ahead and connect our trigger interval here, and boom, hello, cool, nice. So you could see that you could go ahead and update information on these signs pretty much on the fly. All right, guys, the next block to show you here is the cable cluster. This is pretty cool. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we could do here. I'm thinking if we placed a cable cluster in a crafting table, we could multiply the different types of blocks that are available in Steve's Factory Manager and have it all together in the same block. So for example, I could put an item valve and a redstone emitter, and let's also do a block gate, why not? And now you'll note that this cable cluster can act like an item valve, a redstone emitter, and a block gate. Neat. So all we have to do then is come over here and place down some inventory cable, and this guy can do pretty much all the things that we just defined. So if we were to tell it to emit some redstone signal, we could. So when we go over here to input, we'll notice that there is in fact a block gate listed 3 blocks away at 265, 66, 126. And the same for a redstone emitter. There's one of those at pretty much the same coordinates, 3 blocks away. Cool. So that redstone emitter here and the item valve are listed, even though it's actually a cable cluster. It's basically all those blocks in one. So rather than showing you what you can do with that, I mean, I'm sure you can come up with your own imagination on what that can do, but basically you could have the same block be a redstone emitter, and at the same time it can be an item valve, etc., etc. And then if you want, you can combine this cable cluster with something like some inventory cable. And what that'll do is it'll allow, and you have to do it with all of them, right? You have to do all 8. But it'll allow the cable cluster to act as a cable. And that's how you get the advanced cable cluster. Alright guys, the next thing to show you are camouflage blocks. These are really cool. Let's go ahead and play with these just a little bit. So I've got a trigger set to every second update the camouflage block over there. You probably wouldn't want to do that every second. You'd probably just want to do it like once on demand or something, but you might be able to do some cool stuff with this in the workflows. Let's go ahead and specify that it's this cable camouflage block that we're updating. And I'll cover bounds, inside, and sides in just a minute, but we're going to set this camouflage to be cobblestone. And you can see here that it's already toggled itself and made it look just like cobblestone. Cool. And of course, if I wanted to, I could camouflage it like pretty much anything I want. So if I wanted to make it look like wood, boom, it looks like wood. Neat. So that's pretty neat, but there's definitely some other cool stuff. We could also clear camo and it goes back to its default look. Now what's cool about this is you can specify different sides to manipulate here. So I could say that the up side could look like wood and the other side's wooden. And if I wanted to, I could also then say something like, let's disable this for a minute, and say we'll make this look like cobble, and we'll say this. And what we should have here now is all four sides look like cobble, the top side looks like wood, and if we go on the bottom, it should look like nothing, basically. There we go. It's the vanilla cable cluster look. Pretty neat, right? So as you can see, there's a lot of different stuff you could do with this. And that's just the tier 1 version of this cable cluster. See you later, buddy. Let's take a look at double-sided cables. Boom. Double-sided cable camouflage is a little bit niftier. Now the double-sided camouflage gives you a little bit more range of stuff you can mess with. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to create a camouflage updater. When you have the double-sided camouflage, you have access to the inside block. And you'll see that inside camouflage can only be updated in the double-sided cable camouflages. Well, luckily that's what we have, so we should be in good shape. I'm going to tell it to only manipulate the outside of this block. And if we adjust this camouflage to make it look like glass, there we go. And we're going to do all the sides. That's fine. Okay. And then I'm going to have another camouflage guy set up. And he's going to manipulate the inside on all sides to look like cobblestone. Cool. And then I'm going to set up another trigger for this one. And we'll trigger both of these. You ready to see what this looks like? It's pretty cool. Ta-da! So the outside block looks like glass, and because it's see-through, you can see to the inside as to what the inside block looks like. So the inside of these blocks looks like cobblestone. Pretty cool. So you can imagine there's probably some pretty nifty stuff you could come up with to mess with here. Now, if you wanted to, you could also specify for this camouflage. So I'm just going to disable this trigger for a minute. I'm going to say to do both sides, and you'll see now both sides look like glass. Cool. Now the only other setting on here that you'll want to look at for the inside is and I'm going to disable this for a minute, is inverted inside. Okay, what that does is it specifically do sides. So let's do, I'm going to say the north side, and we're going to set that to glass. And with this configuration, and I'm going to set the trigger back up, the north side of this face should be updated to look like glass. Cool. So you can see that the inverted inside is basically when you have the north side on the outside looking like glass, then the south side, the other side of it on the inside will look like glass. But note that on this side, it's cobblestone on the outside. Oh, that is cool. So you can set up some crazy kinds of one-way looking glass type deals that might be fun to play with and build with. That is really kind of neat. Now finally, the third tier of this cable camouflage, the transforming cable camouflage, is even cooler. Let's take a look. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out some of this stuff. And we're going to specify that this block is this guy. And we'll do bounds. Well, that's what opens up. We're going to do both. We're going to do all sides. And then we're going to set this guy to cobblestone. Cool. And that should give us a cobblestone looking block. But now we can mess with the bounds of this block, which is pretty neat. So if we get the X value cut in half to 16 and take a look at it now, you'll notice that it looks kind of like a multi-block. Cool. So you can actually truncate this. And you'll also notice that the player doesn't bump into the bounding box. So if we wanted to get the bounding box here to also on the Y value be half, 16, you'll note that, ta-da, that is cool, right? And it even acts like a stepping block. That's cool. You can, if you want to set the bounds, we'll make this 32, we'll make this 32, and we'll make this 5. Boom. Nifty. And the player can, of course, stand there, and you can drop items there, and everything works just great. If you really want to be crazy about it, heck, why don't you just set the bounds to be 0, 0, 0. Boom. The block is still there. I assure you, you can't place another block in its place. But it's invisible, and I can walk through it. And if you really wanted to be sneaky about it, one other thing that you could do is do something like this and remove collision. Notice that the block still appears to be there, but I can walk right through it because I removed collision entirely. The other option on collision and bounds there is if we did have something like this, and normally I'd be able to walk past it. If I put on the setting for use full collision, then the full bounding box will be there, and you'll notice that I'm now standing on empty air, basically. So there's a couple cool things you could do. You could basically create an invisible block, and you could stand on empty air, or you could create a block that's, has no collision, and you can walk right through it. The only thing to keep in mind is that the cable camouflage is not itself a cable block. So if I want another transforming cable camouflage right next to it, you'll notice that it's not available on the camouflage blocks list because this is not a cable. It does not connect to other devices. However, I just showed you guys cable clusters and advanced cable clusters. So if you wanted to, you could create an advanced cable cluster that had transforming camouflage on it and then turn that into inventory cable. And from there, you could have all kinds of good fun building what's basically an invisible cabling system. You can make your camouflage be invisible with no bounding box. You could walk right through it, and you could basically have cabling throughout your base to connect things. You know what? Let's set that up. That sounds like a lot of fun. So basically, you could have this advanced cable cluster, which remember, advanced cable clusters act like cables, and they've got the transforming cable camouflage on it. Pretty cool. If we come over here to our input slot, we should see that the diamond chest is available 8 blocks away. And if we wanted to, we could set it up so that the camouflage blocks, and we're going to select all of them, and their bounds are going to be 0, 0, and 0. Cool. Doesn't matter what they look like, they're going to be invisible. Ta-da! They're invisible. Cool. You can see I'm still stepping over them. I have to go into the bounding setting and turn off collision. Or turn off full collision. That should work too. And now I'll walk right through them. But guess what? They still exist. And if we come over here, we can see that our diamond chest is still available. And if we wanted to, we could put stuff in it. So just imagine the possibilities with these clusters and these transforming bounding box things. You could have, like, who knows, right? You could have all kinds of invisible things. You could have a block detector that's invisible. You could have inventory cable. You could have all the different things that are available in Steve's Factory Manager. So for example, you could have a redstone emitter that's invisible and the player can't interact with, but it'll still emit a redstone signal when it needs to. And the same for the redstone receiver. And of course, you can link these all into, if-then statements. So you could say, like, if I'm out of cobble, transform this cable to be invisible and all this other crazy wild stuff. The possibilities are basically endless. It's really up to your imagination what kind of crazy stuff you want to do. Like, you could literally build a door that, like, you have to fill a tank with water and then the door opens. Because it would turn the door invisible and, like, make it have no bounding box. And as soon as the tank's full, it would use that as a conditional to open the door. Like, that kind of crazy stuff. Alright guys, the final thing to show you here is the creative supplier. No crafting recipe. This only comes from creative mode or from an op giving it to you. It's really designed for those custom maps that might want to keep a steady supply of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flag the input to be the creative supplier. Items, we can choose cobblestone. And I'm going to go ahead and set a trigger here for this guy, and then we'll set a output slot. And you know what? Let's go ahead and connect it up to that diamond chest I just set up. And its target will be down, activate, and it'll have an empty blacklist, meaning all items in the world are allowed in there. So now what this should do is fill up that diamond chest with cobblestone, slowly but surely. And of course you can manipulate and change it and, make it do all kinds of other crazy stuff. So if we went in here to the cobblestone, we can specify an amount, 65, sure, why not 64? That sounds better. Let's see. Cool. So now it's dumping 64 in there at a time. Nice. So the creative supplier can be used to basically keep a chest full of any items you want. Kind of do whatever you want with it. And then the very last thing I'll mention to you guys is there is a user preferences here. You can see some cool stuff in here like groups will be automatically closed when the user interface is opened. Clicking on the top part of a command or the full small command will open or close it. So different little nifty interface options that you can do for pretty much whatever you want. So that's a pretty nifty bunch of user preferences, and you can set those for yourself if you find stuff to be useful. And for that, I think it's about time to wrap up the Spotlight on Steve's Factory Manager. I definitely hope you guys enjoyed the Spotlight. It's a very cool and extremely powerful mod. You can see that you can do some very simple stuff, from moving items from one chest to another, to some incredibly complex things with conditionals and invisible blocks and half slabs and crafting and liquids and creative mode, and the list goes on and on. It's basically an endless possibility for being able to do different things. It's really up to your imagination. So good news for everyone, this will be in the 1.7 version of the Direwolf 20 FTB pack, so I'm sure a lot of you were curious as to whether or not that's the case. So yes, it will be there, and I will be using it in my Season 7 Let's Play series, and you'll be able to see some really complex contraptions with it. For now, Direwolf 20 signing off. Hope you enjoyed the Spotlight. Take it easy!